I'm a married guy, mid-30s, the kind of life that runs on routines, same commute, same coffee mug, same quiet pride in handling my own business. That detail matters, because this story isn't about my marriage falling apart or anyone sneaking around. It's about boundaries, and what happens when someone decides they don't apply to them. A few months ago, everything felt off. Not at home, but everywhere else. My work, my finances, even small neighborhood stuff started attracting commentary from one specific person who had no business inserting themselves. It began harmless enough, unsolicited advice, little smirks, casual "you should really do it this way" remarks. I brushed it off at first. People talk. People judge. Whatever. Then it escalated fast. Suddenly, my decisions weren't just being commented on, they were being questioned publicly. Deals I was handling privately became topics of gossip. Someone was digging where they didn't belong, poking at things I'd built carefully over years. The worst part wasn't the interference itself, but the confidence behind it, like they were daring me to react. So I did the adult thing. I pulled them aside, calmly, clearly, and told them to stay out of my affairs. No threats. No drama. Just a firm line in the sand. They laughed. And that was the moment I should have known karma had already started warming up. After that conversation, I expected things to cool down. You draw a boundary, people either respect it or back off, right? Instead, it was like flipping a switch. The interference didn't stop, it multiplied. I started hearing my own words coming back to me, twisted. Things I'd said in confidence were suddenly concerns people were whispering about. Decisions I made at work were being second-guessed by people who'd never sat in my seat. Every time I asked how they knew certain details, the answers were vague. Oh, it just came up. Someone mentioned it. Lies, but smooth ones, delivered with a straight face. The person I'd warned acted especially smug. They'd deny everything, then drop oddly specific comments that proved they knew exactly what was going on. One minute they were pretending innocence, the next they were offering sarcastic advice about problems only I should have known about. It felt intentional, like they were testing how much they could get away with. What really shook me was how fast the consequences started stacking up. A deal I'd been negotiating for months suddenly stalled. A small mistake, one that normally wouldn't matter, got blown out of proportion. People I trusted began acting distant, cautious, like they weren't sure where they stood with me anymore. I kept replaying that warning in my head. Stay out of my affairs. I'd said it plainly. They'd ignored it completely. And that's when I realized this wasn't just interference anymore. This was someone setting themselves up for a fall, they just didn't know it yet. The turning point came out of nowhere, like most things do when you're not looking for them. I got a call late one evening from someone I barely talk to anymore, an old acquaintance with no reason to stir drama. Their voice was hesitant, like they were debating whether to say anything at all. They asked me a simple question that made my stomach drop: did you mean for that information to get out? I didn't even need clarification. I already knew what they were talking about. Details that were never meant to leave my circle had been passed around, badly edited, stripped of context. And suddenly, it made sense why doors were closing and people were acting weird. Someone had been talking. A lot. I confronted the person again, this time without politeness. I laid out exactly what I knew, who had heard what, and how it all traced back to them. They didn't apologize. They didn't even deny it properly. Instead, they shifted stories mid-sentence, first claiming they were just concerned, then saying they were trying to help, then flat out blaming someone else when they realized I wasn't buying it. The audacity was almost impressive. Every excuse contradicted the last. Every lie created two more. They snapped at me for being overly sensitive, accused me of being secretive, and somehow painted themselves as the victim for being called out. That's when I stopped arguing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just walked away, knowing something they didn't. Once people start lying that fast, the truth has a way of surfacing without any help at all. And karma? Karma doesn't need witnesses. A week later, the cracks started to show loudly. The same people who'd been acting distant suddenly wanted clarification. Casual check-ins turned into pointed questions. Stories weren't lining up, and the person who'd been meddling was being pulled into more conversations than they could control. I stayed quiet. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to defend myself, to expose everything at once. But I'd learned something watching this unfold. When someone inserts themselves into affairs that aren't theirs, they eventually trip over the details they can't keep straight. And they did. One version of events said in one room didn't match what they'd told someone else earlier that day. They forgot who they'd blamed. They forgot which lie they were standing on. I heard about it secondhand, then from a different source, then again with slightly different wording. Same story, 3 contradictions. Then came the sudden events. A complaint filed that shouldn't have existed. An audit announced with no warning. A random review that somehow centered on the exact topics they'd been gossiping about. Instead of shining a light on me, it dragged them into focus. I remember the moment it clicked for them. You could see it in their posture, the forced laughs, the way they started over-explaining everything. The confidence was gone. In its place was panic. They tried reaching out to me, first casually, then urgently. Messages asking to clear the air, to get on the same page. I ignored them. Not out of spite, but because my involvement was no longer necessary. They had interfered. Now karma was handling the rest. The fallout didn't come all at once. It came in sharp, humiliating bursts. First, I heard they'd been pulled aside by people above them, quiet meetings behind closed doors, the kind that don't end with handshakes. Their version of events was being questioned, not aggressively, just calmly enough to make lying impossible. Every answer led to another inconsistency. Every explanation raised a new red flag. Then something even more sudden happened. One of the very stories they'd spread circled back with receipts. Screenshots. Timestamps. Names attached. The kind of evidence that doesn't yell, doesn't accuse, just sits there, undeniable. I wasn't even the one who presented it. Someone else did, someone who'd been dragged into the mess and didn't appreciate being used. That's when the tone shifted completely. Where there had once been arrogance, there was defensiveness. Where there had been smug interference, there was desperation to control damage. They started backtracking hard, claiming misunderstandings, poor wording, stress. At one point, they even suggested I had asked them to speak on my behalf. That lie collapsed instantly when no one could find a single message to support it. I ran into them briefly during all this. Just a glance. They looked smaller somehow, like the space around them had closed in. No smirk. No confidence. Just a tight jaw and eyes darting, calculating who still believed them. I felt something unexpected then, not triumph, not joy. Relief. Because karma hadn't just corrected the situation. It had made it clear, I'd been right to draw the line, and they'd been wrong to cross it. The final blow came when I wasn't even in the room. I found out through a short, awkward message from someone who clearly didn't want to be the messenger. The interference had cost them more than credibility, it had cost them their position. Not officially labeled as punishment, of course. It was framed as a restructuring, a mutual decision, all the polite words people use when the truth is too messy to say out loud. But everyone knew. The irony was brutal. The very affairs they'd insisted on poking into became the reason their own life unraveled. The gossip they'd treated like currency turned into a liability. People stopped sharing things around them. Conversations went quiet when they entered a room. Trust, once gone, didn't bother coming back. They tried once more to contact me after that. A long message this time. Apologies mixed with excuses. Accountability diluted with self-pity. They claimed they never meant harm, that they were just involved too deeply, that things got out of hand. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry anymore, but because the lesson had already been delivered. Clear, precise, and irreversible. Somewhere along the way, I realized karma isn't dramatic. It doesn't shout or announce itself. It simply balances the scales, then walks away. And all I had to do was stop interfering back. Life didn't magically improve after that, which surprised me. I think part of me expected fireworks, closure wrapped in a neat little bow. Instead, things just settled. Quietly. And that quiet gave me space to actually feel everything I'd been pushing down. There was anger, obviously. Not the explosive kind, but the slow burn that comes from realizing someone watched your life closely enough to meddle in it. There was also embarrassment. Knowing strangers had formed opinions based on half-truths and outright lies stung more than I wanted to admit. But underneath all of that was something heavier: disappointment. I'd underestimated how entitled some people feel to other people's affairs. How easily they convince themselves they're justified. How fast they lie when they're caught. What helped was watching the consequences stick. No sudden redemption arc. No quick recovery. The distance people kept from them wasn't dramatic, it was instinctive. Once trust breaks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes. And erosion is permanent. I caught myself replaying that first warning I'd given them. The calm tone. The clear words. Stay out of my affairs. At the time, it felt almost pointless, like talking to a wall. Now I understood something important: boundaries aren't about controlling others. They're about defining what happens when someone ignores you. And karma? Karma respects boundaries better than people ever do. A strange thing happened after all of that: people started telling me the truth. Not because I asked, because they wanted to. Stories came out about how this person had interfered before, how they'd always framed it as concern or help, how problems seemed to follow them everywhere they went. I wasn't special. I was just the one who finally said no out loud. That realization hit hard. I'd spent so much energy wondering what I'd done wrong, when the pattern had nothing to do with me. Some people don't just cross lines once, they live past them. And when no one pushes back, they start believing those lines never existed. I also learned how fast interference poisons environments. One comment turns into speculation. Speculation turns into assumptions. And before you know it, reality doesn't matter anymore, only the version that spreads fastest. Watching that from the inside changed how I see people, and honestly, how I share things. I became quieter. More selective. Not colder, just intentional. My affairs became exactly that again: mine. No commentary. No background noise. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about them. Nothing dramatic. Just stalled progress, burned bridges, opportunities that almost worked out. Death by 1,000 small consequences. That's the kind of karma that lasts. And I didn't have to lift a finger to earn it. Time did what it always does: it stretched the lesson out long enough to sink in. Months passed. The situation stopped being a story people whispered about and became something quietly understood. The person who once inserted themselves everywhere was now careful, almost invisible. When they spoke, they chose their words like they were stepping on thin ice. When they listened, it wasn't curiosity anymore, it was caution. I noticed something else too: my own instincts had sharpened. The moment someone edged too close to my business, I felt it immediately. I didn't over-explain. I didn't justify. I simply redirected or shut the door. No anger, no speeches. Just clarity. The irony is, nothing I lost during that chaos stayed lost. The stalled deal resurfaced. Trust rebuilt itself slowly but genuinely. People realized, on their own, who had been consistent and who had been performative. Reputation, I learned, doesn't need defending when time is allowed to do its job. I crossed paths with them once, unexpectedly. We exchanged polite nods. That was it. No tension, no need for words. The power had shifted so completely that acknowledgement felt unnecessary. Walking away, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer cared who had lost. Looking back now, the clearest lesson wasn't about them at all, it was about me. I used to believe that staying quiet meant staying safe, that minding my own business would naturally protect it. What I learned instead is that silence without boundaries invites interference. People don't always need permission to overstep, sometimes they just need the absence of resistance. The moment I spoke up, even though it was ignored at first, something irreversible happened. I stopped tolerating disrespect disguised as concern. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't entitled to explanations. And when karma stepped in, it didn't feel like justice, it felt like alignment. If there's any advice buried in all of this, it's simple: your affairs don't need an audience. Anyone who insists on inserting themselves after being warned isn't confused, they're entitled. And entitlement always comes with a bill, even if it takes time to arrive. I didn't ruin anyone. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I just stepped back and let cause meet consequence. And in the end, that was more than enough. What surprised me most afterward was how calm everything felt. No lingering tension, no urge to revisit the past. Just a steady sense that things were finally where they belonged. The chaos hadn't vanished overnight, but it stopped following me around like a shadow. I started noticing how often people confuse involvement with importance. The person who interfered had always needed to feel central, needed to be in the middle of things that weren't theirs. Once that access disappeared, so did their influence. It was almost unsettling how quickly relevance fades when it's not earned. I also learned to recognize the warning signs early, the subtle probing questions, the fake concern, the way some people listen not to understand but to collect information. Before all this, I would have brushed it off as harmless. Now, I treat it like what it is, a signal. Nothing dramatic came from that awareness. Just better choices. Fewer explanations. Stronger walls around the things I actually value. Karma didn't just correct one situation, it reset my sense of control. And that reset has been quietly protecting me ever since. There was one last moment that stuck with me, long after everything had settled. I overheard someone mention their name in passing, followed by a pause, one of those brief silences where everyone knows there's more that could be said, but no one bothers. Then the conversation moved on. No drama. No judgment. Just indifference. That silence said more than any confrontation ever could. Interference thrives on reaction. On attention. On the belief that inserting yourself into someone else's affairs gives you weight. When that belief collapses, there's nothing left to stand on. I realized then that karma isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about removal. Removal from conversations, from opportunities, from relevance. The world doesn't push you down, it simply stops making room for you. I walked away from that moment with a strange sense of gratitude. Not for the trouble, but for the clarity it forced on me. I know now where my responsibility ends, and where it never began. And I know this for sure: once you tell someone not to interfere, and they do it anyway, the consequences are no longer yours to carry. By the time a full year had passed, the story barely felt like mine anymore. It had become background noise, a reference point rather than a wound. That distance gave me perspective I didn't have before. I saw how quickly situations escalate when ego gets involved. How a single boundary, once ignored, can turn into a chain reaction. And how people who can't respect limits often confuse access with authority. They assume proximity grants permission. It doesn't. What stayed with me most was how little effort karma actually required. I didn't need to plan, expose, or strategize. The moment I stopped engaging, the situation began correcting itself. Truth didn't rush in, it waited patiently until lies tripped over their own weight. I became more comfortable letting people misunderstand me if it meant protecting what was mine. Not every rumor deserves a response. Not every intrusion deserves an explanation. Some lessons arrive quietly, but they last longer. This one taught me that restraint isn't weakness, it's confidence. There's a certain peace that comes from knowing you handled something without becoming it. I never matched their behavior. Never spread counterstories. Never tried to control the narrative. That restraint became its own kind of strength. While they were busy explaining themselves, I was busy living my life. I also noticed how karma has a sense of timing. It doesn't rush to satisfy emotions. It waits until the lesson can't be dismissed as coincidence. By the time the consequences fully landed, there was no one left to blame, no angle left to twist. People eventually stop asking what happened. They just adjust their expectations. Trust shifts. Access narrows. Opportunities choose safer hands. If I could go back to the moment I first noticed the interference, I wouldn't change much. Maybe I'd set the boundaries sooner. Maybe I'd stop engaging faster. But I wouldn't trade the outcome for comfort. Because in the end, the most satisfying part wasn't watching karma work. It was realizing I didn't need to. Now, when I think about it, the story feels less like a conflict and more like a reminder. A reminder that not everyone deserves insight into your affairs. That warning someone once is courtesy, repeating it is unnecessary. After that, whatever follows belongs to them. I learned that karma doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it removes, sometimes it simply waits until patterns are impossible to ignore. And when it arrives, it doesn't ask who was right, it just balances what was taken. If there's anything worth passing on, it's this: protect your boundaries early, and trust what happens when they're crossed. You don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You just need to step aside and let consequences find their owner.